program of the 2001-2002 Jepson Leadership Forum series, which I think, as you know, this year explores issues associated with sports, society, and leadership. The focus of tonight's presentation is not just on the role and effects of sports on society and leadership generally, but more particularly on the impact of sports on the lives of the students, faculty, staff, and alumni that are members of our own closely knit community, the university. We are privileged to have James L. Shulman of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation with us tonight to talk about his new book, The Game of Life, College, Sports, and Educational Values. The book, co-authored with William Bowen, president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and former president of Princeton University, was mentioned frequently and hailed by Frank DeFord, our first speaker in this year's forum series. He said of the book, "It is the most important sports book written in years." However, this is not just an important book about sports. Rather, it is an enlightening and insightful look at higher education itself, with particular focus on the tensions between athletics and the academic mission of the university. Using a database with information on 90,000 students from 1951, 1976, and 1989 at 30 selective colleges and universities, including Division I-A private and public universities such as Duke, Stanford, Penn State, University of Michigan, Ivy League universities, Division III private universities such as Emory and Tufts, Division III co-ed liberal arts colleges such as Williams, Denison, Oberlin, as well as Division III women's colleges such as Barnard and Smith. Dr. Shulman and Dr. Bowen present data about a multitude of issues related to college sports. Among the areas they explore are the recruitment of men and women athletes, admission advantages accorded to athletes, how athletes differ from their classmates, what is sometimes referred to as the emergence of athlete cultures on campuses, graduation rates, classroom performance, and choice of areas of study or majors of athletes in comparison to their classmates, post-graduation careers and earnings of athletes relative to their classmates, the costs and revenues associated with intercollegiate sports at universities, and of particular interest to those of us who study leadership. The book presents data from athletes as well as from their classmates concerning their perceptions of their leadership ability, the role of leadership in their lives, leadership roles they assume after graduation in workplace and civic activities, and the like. If you have an opportunity to look at the book, it is your tome in the social sciences. It is replete with tons and tons of data, figures, charts, and so forth, and is really a storehouse of very, very valuable information. Findings from the research bring into question many myths about intercollegiate athletics, and in many cases are quite controversial. For example, while results show that many athletes think of themselves as leaders, there is some question as to whether or not they actually exhibit leadership, at least as conceptualized by Dr. Shulman and Dr. Bowen. I will not go into any other findings of the study, since Dr. Shulman will be elaborating on them shortly. However, I would like to comment that in reading through The Game of Life, one cannot not become concerned about the state of sports and education at our colleges and universities. At the same time, the benefits that athletes and our institutions of higher education derive from intercollegiate sports programs are also quite evident in this work. Dr. Shulman and Dr. Bowen are not anti-athletics. However, they do identify the subtle ways in which athletic intensification at our institutions of higher education may be pulling them from their primary values and missions, and sending problematic signals to society generally about what really matters in the game of life. Our speaker tonight, James Shulman, is Financial and Administrative Officer at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. In his 7 years at the foundation, he has served in a number of capacities. Most notably, he oversaw the building of the College and Beyond database, the source of data for the game of life, and other research on higher education sponsored by the Mellon Foundation. Currently, Dr. Shulman is leading the Foundation's initiative in creating digital resources for the study of art. He's also the author of another volume co-written with William Bowen entitled The Shape of the River, Long-Term Consequences of Considering Race in College and University Admissions, which was published in 1998. Please join me in welcoming James Shulman to the Jepson Leadership Forum.
Working? Working. Okay, I don't know if this is working. We'll see about that. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'll start off by telling you something that happened while I was working on this book and while we were building this database. So this is probably 4 or 5 years ago. I was sitting in my office and I got a phone call, and someone said, hello, this is so-and-so. I work for Bain Consulting, and we're doing a study of X college for the trustees of that study. And it's going to be very empirical and fact-driven, none of this sort of chatter about what's going on campus. We're going to provide hard data so they can really make some good decisions. And I said, wow, that's great. That's terrific. And he says, and I hear you're working on something on athletics, so I want to hear what you're doing. I said, well, it's early on. We're 90,000 students, survey them. It's going to take a long time. And he said, well, our study's going to be done in 4 weeks. And I said, well, we're not going to have anything by then. And he said, well, we're just studying athletics and financial aid and faculty recruitment and faculty retirement and the alumni and admissions and, security issues on campus, all fact-driven. I said, well, that sounds like a lot to me. And he said, well, like on athletics, though, this is, the way that athletics is involved in the campus, it affects a lot of things. I said, yeah, it does. He said, but, all you hear are sort of myths about the role that sports plays. I'm with you. And he says, so, that's why it's all going to be data-driven. So he said, for example, I went to Harvard. He said, and at Harvard, when Harvard beats Yale in the game, it affects giving tremendously. Giving goes up, 15 to 17% if Harvard beats Yale in the game. I said, wow, that is very interesting. I said, those data to me seem to be very hard to gather because you have, who knows who has a campaign going and what other factors are affecting this, whether, it's hard to isolate the impact of one specific event like a football game. I said, plus they hold those data very close to their belt. They don't give out giving data very easily. How did you get that information? He said, one of the coaches told me. So we tried to bring some data to this question, and that doesn't mean that coaches don't have insights into all this, they do. But I think what we tried to do was take some time and gather a lot of data that would provide some useful insight to decision makers. And in the sense that we're alumni or we're worried about where our kids are going to go to school or going to school or what's happening there, I think we all have a stake in this. And I think as the dean said, and no one ever believes this, I am not anti-sports. I love sports. But if this book is going to get put in one pile, it gets put in the anti-sports pile. So my job tonight is to explain what is anti-policies, or as they're currently being conducted about this book, and what I hope isn't taken as anti-sports. Now I'm going to hope this is going to come back up. Yes, success. Put this up here. Yes, okay. First, let me start by telling you a little bit about the database. As you heard, there are 30 schools in the study, and so while you have schools that are thought of as big-time powerhouses, in our Chapel Hill and Michigan and Notre Dame and Rice, and well, not Rice, but Stanford and Northwestern for a good year or two, and Tulane for one good year, and Vanderbilt rarely, and Duke always. That's really not the focus of our database. As you'll see, that the common factor across these institutions, from Swarthmore and Williams and Penn and Princeton to those schools, are that these are all highly selective colleges and universities. And for better or for worse, in this study, what we tried to do is look at how athletics affects a group of schools that are very similar as schools, but very different in terms of how they play sports. So again, is this broadly applicable to all of Division I or to all of higher education? No, it was an attempt to look at a series of focus questions that I think still reverberate throughout the rest of the system. The first thing, and this always shocks people, and I think probably close enough that people can read some of these figures. The first thing that always surprises people is the number of people who are athletes on these campuses. And we'll come back to what that means. But these different bars these are men and women, and these are the Division 1A publics, so the Michigans of the world, the Division 1A privates, the Ivies and the liberal arts colleges. And these are the percentages of the students who entered in 1989, i.e. roughly graduating class of 93, who won a letter of any type during their 4 years. And what you see is that these liberal arts colleges, 30% are athletes, 27% at the Ivies, and 9 and 5 at the big time places. And the patterns are similar for the women, not as many athletes, obviously, yet. And again, this can mean very different things. This is, we had a discussion earlier in the day about philanthropy, and there was a question about data, and if you had data, did you have the answers, and did the answers lead to good policies, kind of thing. And these data need to be dug deeper into. I mean, that 32% of the kids, the male kids at these selective liberal arts colleges are letter winners. Is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing, or what does that mean? Well, it really depends on how they got there. In other words, these are what are usually called participation rates. And in a school's literature to say why you should come to Swarthmore or Williams or Wesleyan or Pomona or wherever, one of the things they might say is you have opportunities. You have opportunities to play in 36 different jazz quartets, or work in 112 different student service organizations, or play on 27 different varsity sports. And so participation rates, I think, are a great thing. These are how many majors you have in the school, how many opportunities for students, unless it's driving the bus. In other words, unless students are getting in primarily to fill those teams and to play those sports. Then somewhere in between that range of are you there, are you on campus because you are a recruited athlete, and I mean, again, no one really looks at how many kids are playing intercollegiate athletics at North Carolina and saying these are participation rates, because there aren't walk-ons in those sports. There aren't people who are showing up on campus and taking up basketball and going out and playing in the Dean Dome. So I think that's something that we try to look at again. Now, who are these students and what are they like, and how much is athletics an integrated part of the campus? I'm gonna just keep going, but if people have questions about a specific figure, feel free to ask. We're a small group, we can have a conversation. But at the end, the good news is I'm stuck in Richmond tonight, so I can talk as long as people want afterwards. So I'm glad to go to questions. So these are the figures for, again, the men only, the same figures in the book for women too, for entering SAT scores at the liberal arts colleges, and these are by sport. So at places like Williams and Amherst and Bowdoin and Bates and Colby, and little colleges where people think that athletics is having zero impact. I mean, when you read the headline in Sports Illustrated about these schools, it is pure and simple. So what you see are that there are gaps in admissions between athletes and non-athletes. These test scores are before recentering, so in football there's a 125-point gap, tennis 120 points, basketball, wrestling, ice hockey, baseball, lacrosse. These get to be not that big, but they still are there, and we'll see what happens as people go through college. So in other words, the first cut is, are athletes exactly like their peers? Are they just like other kids on campus? And the answer here is, no, they're not, but that may be fine. Schools make trade-offs in admissions all the time. The question is how this plays out and what the implications of this are. In this case, we've aggregated women, so here are the gaps for all the athletes versus the non-athletes. And at the women, again, in the more recent class, the 1989 class, you see pretty sizable gaps of 95 and 110 points at the big-time schools, 60 points at the Ivies, and then lower at the colleges and much lower at the women's colleges. So one of the things we tried to look at was the long-term impact of, well, let me step back a little bit. I mean, as you heard from the description of the database, we have a class from the 1950s, a class from the 1970s, and a class from the 1990s. So basically what we wanted to try to do was learn, we wanted to be able to test things that people were taking as givens. Like the good old days were much better than today. Or things haven't changed at all, and and to romanticize the good old days is not accurate either. Or women's sports offers a different model. That's one I've heard a lot, that the women have got it right. The men haven't have gone bad, and we all know that what's happened in college sports with men is terrible, but the women are going to show us a different way. And what you start to see here is that, at least in terms of the patterns of are they different at the time of admission, the women are following the path of the men. This is really legible. What this is now looking at the men in school and what their grade point averages are, how many of them ended up in the bottom third of the class. The red bars represent high-profile sports, and what we mean by that is just football, basketball, and hockey. And then the yellow bar represents the lower-profile sports. This is all the other sports, swimming and track and baseball and soccer and lacrosse and all these things. And the purple bar represents students at large. In other words, students who didn't play intercollegiate athletics. And so what you look over here and you find, I'll pick on the Division I privates. So this is, again, Duke and Rice and Tulane and Northwestern. That 81% of the men who played football, basketball, or hockey ended up in the bottom third of their class. Now, this is not probably a huge surprise to anyone. This is, people say, well, fine, but the sports bring in money, they do other things, but it's a pretty sizable figure. What people, I think, might be surprised about is that 53%, now you're always going to have a third of people in the bottom third of your class, right? And actually among men, you're always going to have a little higher than the third because, surprise, surprise, men do worse than women. So even of the non-athlete men, 35% are in the bottom third. But 53% of the lacrosse players and baseball players are also in the bottom third. Okay, so that's big-time sports, that's scholarship schools. We don't find that so alarming. What I think is more interesting, that at the Ivy League schools and at the co-ed liberal arts colleges, the Swarthmores of the world, you find the same pattern. Again, not up to 81%, but 69% of the men. And then again, 46 and 47% of these people play other sports. So people are doing appreciably less well in school than their peers. Now, the first answer to this might be, well, they're coming in with lower levels of preparation. It's not going to be a surprise that they're going to do less well in school. That is part of it. Sorry, this is just a pattern for women. As you see, the colleges hasn't really hit yet, pretty much even among the women's colleges and the co-ed colleges. A big gap in the Ivies and a big gap in the big-time schools. So again, how much of this is due to differences at the time of admission? Okay, good. What this little plot does is it plots SAT scores along the bottom here versus rank in class. So what this would say is, here's James. Well, here's James maybe over here, but here's James with a 1420 SAT score. I'm a person. This is an actual, each dot is a person. We've reduced this so that it's legible, so you don't have 90,000 people on here. But that this person with 1420 SAT scores finished at the 50th percentile of their class. Now this line, the blue line, represents the best fit line for everybody, for all male athletes in the 1989 Ivy group. So this is just Ivy League schools. In other words, that's where I finished with my 1420 SATs in the 50th percentile of the class. I did worse than everyone else. And this is the line that roughly shows what I would have been predicted to do based on the same factors that everyone else is being gauged on. So the blue dots represent the men who don't play football. The red dots represent the football players. And this gap here is what we call academic underperformance. This gap where the mean line of the athletes is consistently and regularly to be found to be below the mean line for everyone else. So in other words, this is worth stepping it back a bit and looking at. Is this saying that, sure, you let some kids in who aren't as well prepared, aren't as smart, but you get the enthusiasm and the community spirit, sure, they're going to be in the bottom third of your class. That's not what this graph is showing. What this graph is showing is that you got a bunch of red dots up here. You got a bunch of kids with 1,300, this is again pre-recentering, 1,300, 1,400 SAT scores who are, in the very bottom of their class. And you have enough of them that they're pulling the average down for football players. Again, not just these guys down here, but they're pulling the average down for the whole group of high-profile athletes to be distinctly that of their peers. Now, what I think I run across, and I ran across a lot in building the study, is you see these red dots up here? They exist. These are real people. These are kids. How about this red dot? This is a kid with the low SATs in this community who finished in the top 20% of his class. You hear about these people. These are the people that people come to you and say, hey, I know, you're saying that these kids aren't doing their work, they're not trying, they're not doing well. There are kids that are doing exceedingly well, and even these people are graduating, they're doing fine, they're not bad people, but in terms of academic performance, there's a persistent pattern of underperformance. This pattern is found among the high-profile sports, football and basketball. It's also found among the lower-profile sports. The gaps aren't as wide, but they're there in the other sports too. And they're there both at the colleges and at the Ivy League universities, and they're there among women as well as men. Now, the dean said something about a culture of sports, and part of what I'd like to do in conversation later is talk about leadership and culture and a lot of these issues that I think are pretty rich and deserve some conversation. But what is the culture of sports? The culture of sports on these campuses is obviously about sports, it's about winning, it's about playing hard, it's about training, but it's also, there are other elements of it. And a culture, to me, is a set of norms and values and mores that are coherent enough to be distinctive. One of the clear elements of a culture of sports on these campuses is a goal of earning a lot of money. And both these are people's responses to a questionnaire that they were given the day they walked onto campus. So what you see is that at all of these groups of schools, these are men only actually, but the green bar is athletes, the purple bar is non-athletes. The male athletes were much more likely than their peers to say that it was an important or essential goal in life to make a lot of money. And they were also the same pattern on when they were asked about why did you choose this school. They were more likely to say because it would help me earn money than other people who might have had a whole plethora of other goals in going to school. Now, let's take away value judgments here, and this is not the old academic diatribe, that anyone who earns money is bad or anything like that. Just saying that this is one element of a clear culture of difference among the athletes. And I think that it's important to note that this is from the pre-test, right? This is from before they got to school, so we got to see how this plays out. By going forward, for example. What happens at these schools? Well, at the Ivy League schools and at these liberal arts colleges, unlike here and unlike most of higher education, there's no business major. You can't major in business or marketing or management or finance. So what happens at these places is that the athletes major in the social sciences, where they major the closest thing they can find to a business major. And here are the men, again, high-profile sports, low-profile sports, non-athletes. They're more likely to major in social sciences. Again, some of my best friends are social scientists. This is not evil. Next stage is, do athletes earn more money? Are they winners in the game of life? Well, if this is how you define winning the game of life, yes, I will say straight out. The answer is athletes are winners in the game of life. Male athletes consistently make more money than non-athletes. This is from the 1976 cohort. As you see, they're making $14,000 more. The women athletes are also making more. And this is a great control group because these women athletes from 1976 didn't say they wanted to make more money. They didn't say that they were coming to college to make more money, but they ended up making more money. That's interesting. One of the interesting things that we'll follow, or that we follow in the book and we can talk about, is when the curve breaks for the women. In other words, I have no doubt personally that there are a lot of advantages to playing sports and being the type of person who plays sports, and in teamwork skills and cooperative skills, and being driven and being disciplined. And it's just a question of what point an emphasis on sports, either schools' policies in terms of who they admit, or in terms of how much time students spend playing sports, at what point it comes in conflict with some of the other priorities of the institution. And so one of the interesting things is following the women and seeing when they're getting the benefits of playing sports without the cost, and at what point they're paying more of the cost. This is a great slide because what this shows is on this side, this is students' responses to a survey that we sent. 75% response rate. It took a long time to get a high response rate, so we didn't know that we knew that we were hearing from a real representative group. And these are high-profile athletes, lower-profile, and non-athletes, responding to the question of how important in your life since college has competition been? And we asked about a whole range of things: analytical skills, ability to adapt to change. And this is their answers to those who said it was very important. Competition was a very important part of their life post-college. And as you see, it goes lockstep with how seriously they took their athletics. And if you look at this, you say, wow, well, this is good. It's a competitive world out there. And the people who, all those things that all those mantras that we've been repeating for the years, that, learning about how to compete on the field is going to carry over and compete in life, they got this, right? They worked hard, they trained hard, they played hard for 4 years, they come away, and they're more competitive later in life. The only catch is, this is their responses to the same question before they got to college. So in other words, if the justification for having an athletic program is you are training people to compete in a competitive world, the good news is you can save some money, because they were already competitive before they got there. Okay? Now, what's the only logical conclusion that you draw from this? Who should be if your goal is an institution, University of Richmond, wherever you are, is to train people who are ready to compete in a competitive world, who should be playing college sports? Take these people and have them run some laps and have them do some two-a-days, because this is what, if that's the goal. Because if you're taking it and you're already heaping it on people who are coming in off the charts in terms of how competitive they are, if that's one of the benefits that accrues by playing sports, the wrong folks are getting it. We're starting to hit the stuff that we broadly consider leadership, and I'll try to go into some more detail after in discussion about this stuff. Other myth to be tested. And when I say myth, I don't mean that sardonically, and I'm not saying all myths are not true. I mean, there's the myth of the fountain of youth, but there's also the myth that New Jersey is covered in petrochemical plants. It is and it isn't, and it's more complex than that. So I'm not, when I say that we're testing a myth about athletics, I don't mean that it's not true. But there is a myth out there that why do you have sports programs? Why do you have a big-time sports program? Why do you have a sports program at Williams? Why do you have 37 teams? Why are you hiring new coaches? Why are you giving them cell phones? Well, the first response that you usually hear is because the alumni are demanding it. And this is a chart whereby in the same survey, again, cross-section of all the alumni, 3 different cohorts, 50s, 70s, 90s, men, women, high response rate. We asked them, how important is it, how much emphasis does your school currently place on teaching undergraduates, 1 to 5 scale? How much would you like them to place on that, 1 to 5 scale? And then we subtract them to get the difference. So in other words, for teaching undergraduates, most people said, it's a 4, and I want it to be a 4.7. So that they want more emphasis on teaching undergraduates, more emphasis on residential life, more emphasis on intellectual freedom, more emphasis on extracurricular activities, across the board until you get to athletics, where they want distinctly less emphasis on intercollegiate athletics. Now, the other big negative one here is faculty research, right? Surprise, surprise. But again, how many times do you hear a president stand up and say, well, the reason we do faculty research is because the alumni are demanding it? Not very often, but you do hear that about sports. Now we're going to pull that apart a little bit because that's an aggregate, that's all your alumni. Let's look at this a little more detail. Surprisingly, in some ways, where did they feel this most strongly? At the Michigans and the Chapel Hills of the world. So, so this is the 1976 class only, but they're off the charts. They want a lot more people want less emphasis on athletics. Same is true at the Division I privates. Less at the Ivies, less at the colleges, and at the women's colleges, they want more emphasis on sports, probably thinking that it's time to catch up a little bit. But let's pull that apart a little more, because this is where it gets really interesting. Let's look over here. Now we're at the Division I publics. Now we're splitting up between students at large, the alumni generally, and the former athletes. So again, we can sort out their survey responses. So what you see here is the alumni at large, despite all the people wearing those, blue Michigan letters all over the place, the alumni at large want less emphasis on sports. Even the athletes want less emphasis on sports. So these are the people, this is Ted Leland, the athletic director at Stanford, saying to us, that he goes out and tries to raise money for Stanford from former athletes. They say, I gave my knee to Stanford, and that's all you're getting from me. And that's these guys here. The Division I privates, not so. The alumni at large want less emphasis, but the athletes want a little more. And now this is where it gets sort of fun. At the Ivy League, the alumni at large want less emphasis on athletics. The former athletes want more. Same thing at the colleges. And now let's look back. Let's go back to that first chart where we see what percentage of your class are athletes. And all of a sudden you see this strange transgenerational self-fulfillment thing whereby you go out and recruit athletes because you think it's not going to hurt your school, they're going to do fine, they're going to graduate, it'll make more money somehow for the school. And next thing you know, those graduates, those freshmen, are your alumni. And when it comes time for them to vote with their feet or with whatever else, they're telling you they want more emphasis. So your schools are shaping their own future when you're making your class. Again, now I try. You hear judgments in my voice, and that's inescapable. But these are the data. And then if you want to start and say, well, but maybe this is the best thing that the school does, and a lot of these alumni athletes or non-athletes who love sports would say, this is great, this is clear, these are good kids, these aren't the muddled deconstructionists on the other side of campus. That's fine. We can ask the next how to interpret these data, but it's first good to figure out what the facts are. Now this is a little complicated to read, but it's pushing that all one step further. Now we're looking at the views of those institutional priorities from three groups. The alumni, these are just regular alumni. Then these are the non-athletes who became alumni leaders who on their survey said, in one of their 12 civic activities, they were class secretary or a trustee or something like that. Their view, so the alumni leaders who weren't athletes, and then the alumni leaders who were athletes, okay? So this is how much emphasis do you want on a liberal arts education? The alumni leaders generally sort of feel like the alumni. They want more emphasis on the broad liberal arts education. The athletes want a little less. That's okay. The athlete alumni leaders, the trustees. Intellectual freedom. Non-athletes and the rest of the alumni, the leaders represent basically what everyone else wants. The athlete alumni leaders still want more emphasis on intellectual freedom, but not quite as much. When you get over here to athletics, here are the alumni at large. We saw that earlier. They want less emphasis on athletics. Here are the non-athlete alumni leaders. They still want less emphasis on athletics, generally, but they still want more than these guys, right? They're more faithful to the school, more into school spirit, may want bragging rights around the water cooler. But look at the athlete alumni leaders. These guys want a lot of emphasis on sports. And then it's similar a little bit in other extracurricular activities. So what you generally see is the athletes want more emphasis on the less academic parts of what's going on campus. And then the last unpeeling, and I appreciate your patience for 12 slides on the same subject, but it's fun stuff, at least for me. I don't know. Okay, these are now, this is really interesting. These are the views of the athletes and the athlete alumni leaders on athletics. Okay, now we're really drilling down. So let's just take one example here. Here's the Ivy League. Remember how we saw earlier that the athletes who went to the Ivy League schools want more emphasis on athletics and everyone else doesn't? So here they are right here. Here are the athletes who went to Ivy League schools. Then here are the athlete alumni leaders. These guys are off the charts, okay? These guys want 3 times more emphasis than even the other athletes who went to these schools. So in other words, when you're a president, you're a president of Princeton or Penn or Williams or Amherst or Bowdoin, and you go and you're speaking to the alumni club at Tampa, and the class secretary who introduces you, the head of the Princeton club of Tampa says, you know, I don't know what the hell's going on at Princeton, but they're 1-6 in football this year, and we got to do something about that. You don't know if you're president, if that's what all your alumni think, or if that's some part, or what. Is the president in the room? No. Okay. But what this tells you is that the athletes who are alumni leaders are more energetic or excited about this than even the athletes who are alumni. These are the institutional priorities of the top 5% of givers. In other words, the top 5% of people who donate money to the school donate, depending on the year, but up to about 60 or 70% of all the gifts that the college gets. So when they say something, it matters, right? And so here are their priorities. It's hard to read, but basically what you see down here is that athletics are still a minus. These are, again, even among the top 5% of givers, with faculty research being lower. So in other words, it's not just that the alumni feel one way, but who cares, because the big givers feel another way. The big givers feel basically the same way. Okay, now this figure is from one school, and it's drawn a lot of fire because it's only from one school. It's only from one school because it's only from one school that we had data for all 3 years. And what these data are the admissions advantage. And what that means is, these are for, the gray bar is underrepresented minorities, the brown bar is legacies, and the green bar is athletes. And this means of all the people who applied to this school in 1976, so again, not just the ones that got in, what did being one of these targeted groups do for your chance of being admitted? So for this school in 1976, if you were black or Hispanic, you got a big boost in admissions. This is controlling for SAT scores. So in other words, if you had 1,200 SAT scores, and if I had it and I'm African American, and my friend here had the same SAT scores but wasn't African American, I would have this much better of a chance of getting in. And so here are minorities, here are legacies, and here are recruited athletes. By 1989, you see the odds were about the same for everyone, but now the athletes had risen higher. By 1999, the athletes were distinctly more likely to get in. In other words, if you were recruited athletes on the coach's list, now this is a non-scholarship school. At scholarship schools, this is very different. For the most part, if you're over the NCAA hurdles of minimum scores, for the most part, schools will take admit the kids who the coaches recruit, and then it's a question of where the kids are going. So what this says is these highly selective schools, being a really good lacrosse player or being a really good 100-meter butterfly swimmer is a really good ticket into these schools. Now again, we can debate the merits of that, but I think that it's just, it's really time to stop saying, oh, well, we're looking for well-balanced kids, and gosh, a kid who plays sports is just like everyone else, and it might help a little bit, but it also helps to be a talented violinist. It helps a lot more to be a talented lacrosse player. These are the figures for women, and as you see, the pattern's almost exactly the same. I'm going to try to spare you a little of this. No, those we've already seen. I think that's probably enough, because I really want to have some conversation. I guess I will talk about leadership, which is to say the figure that you saw in competition is exactly the same for leadership. In other words, students who were asked to rate themselves in terms of leadership at the time they were admitted and then later in life, the athletes are far and away, men and women, more likely to rank themselves as having strong leadership skills. Again, I was trying to tease out of the dean at cocktails what what we're calling leadership, what we should be calling leadership. I don't know if that's a measure of self-confidence. I don't know if it's a measure of, being told you're a leader because you're or being the captain of a team. I mean, I guess, you're rarely going to be the captain of the orchestra, but you might be every, softball team is going to have a captain, and so maybe that's what does it. Or maybe it's, the societal sort of support for kids. I mean, when my daughter kicks the ball, I'm like, yeah, that's terrific, and that there's a reinforcement that this is tied to leadership. All I can say is one thing that measures is that in terms of how athletes feel, they feel like leaders. One thing that we found very clearly, and I take this finding very seriously, is that in terms of civic activities later in life and leadership roles in civic activities, athletes were more likely to be leaders in sports clubs, and they were more likely to be leaders of youth groups, where we defined it as Little League and scouting and soccer and things like that. So in those two categories, athletes were much more likely to be leaders. In everything else, they weren't. They were just like everyone else. They were likely to be leaders, but so were the other graduates of Penn and Duke and Princeton and all these places. And so they weren't less likely. I'm not saying that they're not, they're shirking their responsibilities. But this finding is very telling because when we wrote the earlier study of underrepresented minorities, who were similar in a lot of ways, also had lower SAT scores. In 8 out of our 11 categories, African American males were more likely to be civic leaders than white males, than their white classmates. So that said, if the justification for using race as a factor in admission, one of the justifications is you get a more diverse student population, but you also are contributing to the leadership of certain segments of society. Those data showed up when we looked at race. Didn't show up in terms of sports. So you have a group of people who feel like leaders, who make more money, and so if leadership is defined by making more money, then that's clear. But in terms of the civic activities, they weren't showing up as more likely to be leaders. We can go into why they make more money and how they choose fields that are more likely to make money and all that, but again, trying to parse out the different elements of this and then figure out what it means. The last thing I will say is the most important part of this to me is actually not even what's going on campuses, believe it or not, and not what schools are doing and not the degree to which academics are being traded off for other parts of what universities provide for people. The most important part of this are the signals that are being sent because people, one thing economists have learned very well is that people listen to incentives. And so when I do a call-in show in Baltimore on the book, and I have a kid call who says, I'm 13 years old, and I'm taking physics, and I go to a high school in Baltimore, are you telling me I should be working on my jump shot? My answer is, And then my second answer is, I don't think there's a college president in this country who would say, absolutely, no, don't worry about physics. You work on your jump shot, and then you're really on the right track. That's what they would say. But what they're doing and what their admissions policies are saying more clearly than words are really rather ambiguous. And so I think that this effect of not saying sports are healthy and fun part of life and you learn lessons and it's a good thing to do and all that stuff, but saying your best ticket into an academic institution that is going to reject 9 out of every 10 kids is to be really good, really focused, really specialized in one sport, not a well-rounded kid, but to be really good at a certain thing, a certain sport, is your best way in here. I think sends a signal that the kids can get on their own, right? I mean, kids can devote themselves to sports without the academic institutions of our country saying, this is what you should be doing. I'm a little more, again, back to my 20-month-old, it's not hard for her to eat chocolate. It's hard for her to eat spinach, right? And my job is to get her to eat spinach. And she'll eat chocolate plenty. And so I think when the signal coming from schools is, really, really focus hard on eating chocolate and do it really well, and we'll take you here, I think that's where the message gets a little confused. Thank you. going to try to break that up in a couple of parts because there are a couple elements to that. One is, first thing I'll say is that, to be honest, I think that the state institutions have a different set of responsibilities. And when I say that, I mean that the University of Iowa is a common property of the people of Iowa. So is Michigan and Chapel Hill and UVA. And so while I still think that sports isn't the greatest investment, either financially or in terms of what you do academics, I think that the first governance issue is, to whom does the school belong? And the answer is rather clearly that the people of the state are subsidizing it rather heavily, much more heavily than they're subsidizing the private institutions. So, I'm a president and I listen to the people of the state of Virginia. I have to listen a little more, including the state legislature. Then, on the question of the foundations, I think it's a little dangerous to let governance outside of institutional control on just about any issue. And I think that, I guess my goal would be, the first step would be for people to really understand the math of all this. I spoke mostly about the student side of things, but there really is there is a budgetary question here, and very, very, very rarely is athletics a good financial investment. And you wouldn't think that when people say, why do schools play sports, or why do they play big time sports? People would say, for the money. And you say, for the money, meaning that the University of Michigan, who had 110,000 people fill every home game in football for the last 70 years, lost $3.9 million directly 2 years ago. Now, why is that? Well, that's because costs are very fixed. I mean, you're not going to go from having 19 assistant football coaches to, oh, well, we have a bad year this year, so let's cut down to 12. The costs are always going to be there in terms of labor, in terms of maintaining the facilities, and yet the revenues are very volatile. So one year you go to a bowl game, great, you get some money. Or you get this many TV appearances, you get some money. Or you get this far into the Final Four tournament, you get a little more money, or depending on how your conference shares revenues. But the costs are always going to be constant. So I think in terms of the foundations that support programs, there's a lot of money flowing through them and flowing to support these programs. But the question of whether it's actually making a lot of money for the school is, the evidence is rather mixed. So I guess the long and short of it is, the first thing to try to figure out is what's really going on and try to be clear about it, because then I think it's a lot easier for trustees or for legislatures or for presidents to make well thought out decisions rather than ones, as I say, back to my example about the alumni club. If your first 5 questions are people saying, what the hell is going on with the football team, you're going to get the impression this is all my alumni care about, and you're going to act accordingly.
Since you collected the data in 1989, there's been a tremendous amount of legislation passed with scholarship restrictions, initial eligibility. What, if any, has that impacted your study? Do you know that yet?
We don't. We're updating some of the data for the Ivies and the liberal arts colleges to get more recent data. So that's still in the works. One of the things that I take from your question is that it reminds me that it's all easy for me to stand up here and say, oh, this is bad and this is bad and this has gotten worse and that's bad, as if this is easy to solve. And I find this to be one of the most sort of insidious competitive models where there aren't villains. There's not some guy in the back room saying, here's how I can undermine the academics of this place. No one's doing that. And so the NCAA, a lot of people say, oh, the NCAA, they're the bad guys. But they're just trying to police a situation that's tremendously difficult to police. And so what inevitably happens, you squeeze a tube in one place and everything goes to another place. And I think so when legislation to set bars for what you need to get in or what you need to qualify for your to keep your scholarship are tightened, what I think ends up happening is people are so passionate about this stuff is that the system gives somewhere else along the line. The best example are the Ivy Leagues, where they have something called the academic index, which said that for each school there's a very complicated statistical formula. For each school, your the athletes' mean high school grades and test scores could only vary so much from the rest of their class. Well, then what happened was people, figured out how to game the system. They'd say, well, let's take a high SAT kid who's never going to play and a lower SAT kid, and they'll average each other out. And then they caught on to that. And then they said, okay, well, if we're only going to get so many kids, let's take ones who aren't going to mess around, right? So you got kids who are more and more focused on athletics, and so, even though they might have, might fit within the required band, they end up academically underperforming more. So unless I'm not answering your question at all, which is entirely possible, my impulse is to say that the efforts to tweak the system are good and should be kept up, and I think there are a lot of explicit, really bad things that the rules keep from going wrong. But that what needs to change is what those people who, especially those of us who really love sports, want their programs to be doing, whether they can accept a certain level of play or parity or things like that that are hard to accept when you're cheering.
I'd like to come back to your last slide, which showed that the chances of athletes getting into even school college are greater than other categories.
Right?
Can you explain why that is so? Is somebody that goes through, and I talk about Williams more and more becoming, has somebody eventually decide to give athletes more immersion, so to speak, in it so far?
Well, first let me say that the extent of that my slide can't be generalized is the degree of difference. I mean, I think that this was definitely one school, and it was clear that was just one school. But the patterns, we do have data from other schools now for that most recent year, and the relative levels do fluctuate. In some places, especially places where it's hard to recruit underrepresented minority kids to the campus, those levels between the minority advantage and the athlete advantage are closer. And in some cases, the minority advantage is higher. So it's not universal truth. However, at all cases at these non-scholarship schools, the advantage to athletes is at that level or comparable. So why does that happen? Well, I think the first answer is a tricky one, where I think that it's sort of a series of sliding justifications. It's sort of some of the things that we've tried to bring some data to. Well, yeah, these kids, their SATs are lower, but they're more likely to be leaders, and so it's taken as athletic excellence is taken as a proxy for leadership. And I sort of wince when I say that, because I believe in taking athletic participation as one measure of a well-rounded person who can do a lot of things. But when you focus more on talent, on hand-eye coordination and times in the 40-yard dash, then I find it harder to justify that that's leadership or well-roundedness more than some other kid who might have played all 4 years but doesn't have that talent. So there's that justification. There's the vague feeling that this is good for the school in some undefined way. And there's also, I think, at the very bottom of it is a sense that I get every time I talk to a faculty committee on athletics, which is I say, well, they're saying we're trying to figure out if we should move up a level or hire a new coach or lengthen the seasons or whatever. And I say, well, what, and they say we have, the athletic directors on the committee and a trustee and some faculty members and some students and staff. And so we've, built a group to really look at all aspects of this question. And they said, well, and the first thing we did is we went out and we talked to some of the kids who play on the team. And they say, you know what, these are good kids. They usually say, these are damn good kids. And I look at them and I say, I'm sure they're good kids. I mean, first of all, there are a lot of good 17-year-olds in the world. I think most of them are pretty good. And second of all, there are a lot of good kids who are at these, who are on a campus and are excited about being there. And, their board scores might be lower, but, they tell you what they're excited about. And so the sort of overwhelming sort of reluctance to change this, and they're graduating. I mean, one thing I didn't point out is one of the myths that we did puncture that is, pro-athletics is that kids are graduating at very high rates. the non-scholarship schools higher than everyone else, and even at the the Northwesterns of the world, at very high levels. So these kids aren't failing out or anything like that. And so I think a lot of questioning of why this much emphasis is placed on athletics loses steam in that context of meeting kids or seeing kids or having them in class. And again, a lot of this there's nothing bad about this at all. I mean, I know a lot of faculty members who say, I had athletes in my class and it was really fun because they didn't have 1,600 SAT scores, but I could add a lot of value there. And I maybe had to put a little more time in, but they got more out of it. And is that a bad thing? No, that's not a bad thing. But the question, what I think isn't fair is there are a lot of kids in this country who a school like Richmond or a school like Williams could add a lot of value to. And it's not really fair to have one system for all those kids and then for a few kids to say, well, we really want you because you got a 39-inch vertical leap, and yet we're going to say that we really have a system of adding value through education. So I think the main conclusion I have is that no one's felt like anything's been going wrong, so there wasn't any need to fix it. I think now there's some better understanding of what the trade-offs are.
You give us five data from what I would consider generally elite schools there. Can you generalize to the UNLVs of the world, the University of Alabama, the schools that we think of as
Right.
elite athletic competence?
The main conclusions that I think do carry over, one is that the finances aren't as rosy as we all think. I mean, I think that to play at the big time level means making a major financial commitment. And in terms of scholarships, in terms of facilities, all that, coaches. I mean, it's an arms race without end. I mean, I keep saying to people, that we all grew up with an arms race going on, but that ended at some point. Either they couldn't keep up, or the underpinnings of the Soviet system wasn't good, and at some point they lost that arms race. And this is an arms race that never wins. I mean, I remember when Kentucky won the tournament a few years ago, and the headline the next day was, "Will they do it next year?" And I think that's a tough trap. And so that there's always room for a better weight room or something that will improve recruiting. And so I think that model, the financial part of it, I think is a real issue at a lot of places. And I think in terms of the athletic culture, I think that carries over to a whole range of places. Again, with the good parts to it and the bad parts to it. And I think we hear plenty about it in terms of separate dorms and separate tables and all that stuff. And I think that, again, depending on what a school's looking for from athletics, at least at some places, integration of people into the community so that people learn from each other is a big part of what it should be about. But in terms of some of this other stuff, it's very different in terms of the academic trade-offs aren't nearly as big at places where, basically it's fairly close to open admissions. And so you don't have that opportunity cost of the kid with, really high board scores and really talented in a lot of realms who may have even played high school sports but wasn't that good of not getting in at all. So that I think is different at the big time places.
Back to the graduation rate of the student athlete, the 5-year graduation rate of a class versus student body from only B schools. Do you have that data? Showing the student athlete in the bottom third of the class, well, like you said, there's always bottom thirds every class, whether there's no athletes.
Right.
All of the school is still a bottom third of that class.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have the slide. It's in the book, but I don't want to hold that up. But the answer is that the athletes are graduating at very high rates. So, and in the 1950s, they were graduating at much higher rates. They were graduating at high rates, and everyone else is graduating at lower rates. In the 70s, that gap closed. And by the 90s, you've gotten to the point where people, when they're investing $25,000 a year in college, and they've gone through so many hoops to get in and screens to get in, basically everyone's graduating at very high rates. So the athlete's advantage over everyone else has diminished. But they're across the board graduating at very high rates. So despite being in the bottom third of their class, you're absolutely right. They're graduating, and as the earnings data show, they're getting high-paying jobs. So the questions of what the penalties are maybe too subtle for some of these things. I mean, in the sense that the NCAA tracks graduation rates, and in terms of graduation rates, it's just not an issue. University. All this is compiled from data directly from the schools. The only data that we have from our surveys, and again, it's a rather long survey and it's pretty dense, but it doesn't allow for a lot of flavor. So on that territory, it's a little lacking, I think. But is that universally, the athletes look back at their experiences, recent or less recent, and thought that it was a great experience. I mean, again, as you see among the big-time athletes, there is some degree that they want less emphasis on athletics. But they look at their experience very positively. I think one of the interesting differences, again, with the African Americans from the other study, which is I find rather telling, and this is not from our data. This is from another study that some social psychologists did on 3 or 4 of these campuses, same campuses. And they found that the African American kids were academically underperforming as well. So again, another real parallel in it with lower SAT scores, still very high, but lower than their classmates, and then academically underperforming. What they found was that the African Americans still identified with the academic mission of the place. In other words, they say, they said in their surveys, more detailed surveys, how did you do? Do you think you could have done better? The kids said, on average, yeah, I wish I had done better. While the athletes said, I probably could have done better, but it was the best 4 years I ever had. I had a great time, made great friends, I have a great job. And so even though there is that same academic underperformance, the athletes that they found, again, felt like that was okay. Yeah, it's an interesting question. We tried to control away the underperformance by asking whether it was different socioeconomic backgrounds or things like that, and some of those were significant, but weren't nearly as powerful as just being an athlete. So we tried to say, okay, the main way we tried to test this was say, okay, well, athletics takes a lot of time, right? I mean, it's not just that you might have lower levels of preparation. You're spending 10, 20, 30, how many hours a week training and practicing and traveling, and that's bound to eat into your grades. And there's no way to test definitively how much that is, but what we did do is identify a group of people who were very active in other extracurricular activities. And so not just everyone who wrote for some literary magazine, but editors of the newspaper, people who were in orchestras, people who were leaders of drama organizations and things like that. So people that we had some sense had spent a lot of time on their non-academic work. And what we found among them, and again it's different because it may not be physical and things like that, and it may not be as exhausting, is that among that group, they overperformed academically. So it seemed, for whatever reason, that their activities that were taking substantial amounts of time weren't in conflict with their academic work. Is which? Oh, it's definitely different. Yeah, it's an identified. Well, in that case, we're trying to compare apples to apples and leave oranges out. That group of extracurricular participants, We ran a regression equation which controlled for SATs. So that was saying that if they had the same SATs, would they be predicted to perform at the same level? Right. In case anyone's wondering, Jim is an economist, and a good one. The answer, to restate your question, Jim was saying, you're calling this academic underperformance, but in essence, what you might be capturing is the fact that these people just aren't as academically overperforming as everyone else. And I guess my answer would be, yeah, that might be right. I mean, some part of this, and back to your question about what the factors are that contribute to this, some part of this is definitely due to differences at the time of admission for both the underrepresented minorities, I think, and for the athletes. It's not that their academic performance is due to playing sports in college. I think some good part of it, and we're able to try to tease this out a bit, some good part of it was already there before they were admitted. They were, as you say, they weren't as, even if they had the same SATs, they weren't as off the charts in terms of other levels of preparation. What I think is interesting is when we try to account for that, the differences beforehand by adding in other variables, high school GPA, high school rank, achievement test scores, things like that, that was able to explain some of it, but not all of it. So, and I think one of the weird things that we found was when we added to the regression equation whether people on their survey, so this is a survey they take, either 3 years out of class, out of college, or 10 years out of college. When we added to the equation whether they had had a mentor who was a coach, we asked them, did any of these people serve as a mentor, faculty member, residential dean, whatever, or a coach? Those at the liberal arts colleges who had said a coach was a mentor had an additional academic penalty. Now, that's not blaming the coaches. If there are coaches in the room, I'm not blaming the coaches, because it may well be it's the kids who are inclined to devote themselves even more to athletics, pay more of an academic penalty. And that's where you start to get at what's going on campus, or at least their campus experience. Well, I think Hutchins, did something brave or whatever, but I think he also ended up, poisoning the waters. I think, a lot of reform movements have sort of, looked at their presidents and said, are you pulling a Hutchins on us? And we're not going to end up as the University of Chicago. I think there is a hope for reform, or changing direction, or reconsidering the question has to be collective. I think any president who tries to change things on his own is just, or her own, is just looking for trouble. I think it needs the backing of trustees. I think, I keep hearing, there have been reform. I mean, this book's been written, 10 times over the last 100 years. I mean, people are writing reports for years saying that there are problems. And people always say, well, the presidents have to take charge. I don't know. I know a few college presidents, and it seems to me that they're at the whim of a lot of forces. And I think really trustees need to take charge. And even trustees, it's the only Nixon could go to China kind of thing. The trustees who played sports and who love sports and who want to say, well, let's take another look at how how extensive our commitment is and what our trade-offs are. So I think that's a big element is the trustees have to take charge. But when you ask what's my sense of reaction, the story that leapt to mind, and I apologize for being personal here, is again back to my daughter, who does this thing where when she was crawling across our living room, and we have a tree in our living room, she'd pull herself up and she'd take dirt out of the tree and throw it over there. And my wife and I thought, well, this is a good chance to teach her some discipline. So we'd say, no, Kai, no dirt. So then she would crawl across and pull herself up and take the dirt and throw it out and look at us and say, no. And I think that's a lot what I hear. I hear a lot of presidents saying, this is very bad. And we'll have to see what happens. Yeah, what you mean at big time places or? Yeah. I guess I wouldn't start there. I would start with, sort of other ends of the system. I think that the danger there, I think that this has to be an inclusive attempt at reform. It has to be, this is not you people are bad or you people want to cheer in the football stadium or, who love a diving catch on a crisp autumn day or, are against the place or you're not part of the place. Because I've cheered at those games, and so I think that that's my Hutchins comment. I think someone who does that is just looking to alienate large, parts of the alumni for no good reason. And so I guess if there is a brave group who wants to do something, I think it's the places that might say, there have been motions over time for Northwestern and Duke and Tulane and Wake to play each other in things and not to try to keep up with the Florida states or the Michigan states and to form another league, something like that. I think that's one area of reform. I think certainly a lot of these other sports, I think, while if you didn't give, if Duke stopped giving scholarships in baseball, the baseball alumni would go nuts. But, you could still play baseball and you could still even recruit for baseball, but you could just stop saying, a Duke education which costs, $30,000 that's being subsidized somewhere, we're not gonna pay out of the public coffers for baseball. I don't even know if Duke has baseball scholarships, but that kind of thing. I think those would be the ways to start saying, look, we're not saying get rid of the, burn it down. We're saying, let's try to, move back towards smaller part of our class being devoted towards this, fewer financial resources being devoted towards this, and still, and then if someday, well, look what happened to Swarthmore. Swarthmore dropped football, and, people went nuts. Now, how many people went nuts? Not a lot, but those people went very nuts, and one of them was a former president of the NFL and who had been a former member of the Board of Trustees, and, and it almost cost the president his job. And so I think that radical action, especially on a single institutional level, but even in a group, is probably, it's never going to get across why and how you're doing it. So I think that sort of starting by nibbling at the edges is the right way to go. Now, I've been criticized for this. We got one review of the book that said these guys wrote a beautiful bomb and then decided not to light the fuse. But I sort of think if you start wishing for everything to work out, then I might as well say, well, it'd also be nice if the Palestinians and the Israelis just sort of sat down and worked this out and it'd be okay.
Are you saying then let's start with the non-drinking sports and then we'll weigh it over?
That's what I'd go. That's one suggestion. That's what I'd go for.
The problem is we're going in the other direction.
Yeah.
Title IX is supposed to increase revenue in men's basketball, football, for the women's teams.
Yeah.
Now, as an economy, can you go back? You're counting on multi-million-dollar television counting on you. Car dealerships, car manufacturers are counting on you to carry their television in.
Yeah.
I think it's impossible to go back.
Well, going back is always hard. I think that's why, a lot of, I don't know if there are any philosophers in the room, but, what you always hear, and there's one refrain in ethics, if we could go just back to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and when the world was a clear place where there were rules and everyone understood them, we were nice small communities. That's all fine, but we're not going back there either. I think one thing that, in terms of a governance structure issue, is the every tub on its own bottom model, which I think people propose, meaning that athletics has to support itself and cover it, both bring in the money to cover its costs. I think people, some institutions look at that as a way of, taming athletics. They say, we're not going to let, the rest of the school pay for this enterprise. But they don't realize that there are costs to the real cost of that model, i.e., as you say, what it forces in terms of programs having to get their own revenues. I mean, Vanderbilt, when it hit a decision point about 4 years ago, said, no, we're going to go into the Duke model. We had been on this thing where the athletics had to fund itself, and instead it now is being at least subsidized partially by the central administration, saying, if we're going to do this, it's something that the university supports. And I think that that gives you more latitude to then, as an institution, control your own decisions. Because once you say, you got to go fend for yourself, you got to do things to fend for yourself. Yep. Well, it's the issues are different. The costs are lower, but yeah, no, I think one of the things that our data prove is that no one has it right, and I think it's a good point that it doesn't instantly get you to a place where everything's aligned. But I think while those places still have issues, they don't have all the issues, and they're moving, as you were saying, everything's moving upward. Untouched, the Ivies will become more like the big time places, and the colleges will become more like the Ivies, and women's sports will become more like men's sports. And so I think the question is, how do you slow the never-ending spiral? I think we should call it a night, but thank you all very much.